The Ebola crisis triggers unrest in Sierra Leone.
Confirmed case of monkeypox identified in a patient hospital.
New cases of Zika in Florida. Tonight,
2 billion people could catch the H1N1 flu virus.
Coronavirus has now spread to every continent except...
If we face an immediate threat and we are challenged and perhaps our life is in danger, we react.
The CDC has now increased the emergency response.
We try to protect not only ourselves, but our family, our children. But if that threat passes, then I think we tend to forget.
Lawmakers and public health officials say that years of budget cuts have hurt their ability to respond to threats like Ebola.
If you are a public health official, you have to think a little bit differently.
What more can we do? When are we going to learn this lesson that the best...
You have to make sure that you are prepared in terms of looking, at the next outbreak.
The Food and Drug Administration was created at a time before people actually knew that emerging infectious diseases were a thing.
I came to the agency in 1991. And one of the things at that time, the regulations told you how to make the vaccine. It told you what cell lines to use. It told you how many lots you have to make, how many things you have to test.
In a pandemic, the two big competing concerns are how do we do things rapidly, but how also do we do things rigorously?
One of the things FDA did was made the regs somewhat more flexible so that you could keep up with the technologies. You could be a little bit more nimble.
That changed, at least when I was at FDA, in 2009.
Flu threat. Federal officials are now preparing for a fall surge in swine flu.
Compared to seasonal influenza viruses, this virus also circulated in the summer months.
This could be a pandemic that killed or hospitalized a lot of young people.
For children, for young adults, the rate of death from H1N1 is at least 5 times higher.
And that really worried public health authorities around the country and around the world.
There was great concern that there would be a wave of disease in fall of 2009.
This virus spreads very efficiently.
1 million Americans have been sickened by the swine flu.
There have been shortages of ICU beds and ventilators.
And so we had to make sure that we had a vaccine available by fall of 2009.
That was a very compressed timeline.
When flu season starts, swine flu will spread and fast, and it could get stronger as a virus. As a result, a race is on to get a vaccine ready.
We really had to change our approach to really figure out how to license this vaccine quickly.
While we were accustomed to making flu vaccines every year, we weren't accustomed to dealing with a flu virus that appeared to be so much more virulent than the standard H1N1 was.
To be able to make a vaccine, that process just unfortunately takes a few months.
This is a pandemic strain, but since the manufacturing is the same, maybe we can look at what we called a strain change.
Even though it was more virulent, that means it got more people sick, it consisted of the same subtype already in the seasonal vaccine.
A strain change doesn't require a full-blown efficacy study.
So it didn't need clinical data, and that saved some time.
It really isn't, in strict sense, a new vaccine. It's a strain change of a vaccine process that has been used for a very long period of time.
We discussed that with other U.S. Public health agencies, with the CDC, with the NIH.
Took that to the advisory committee.
And they listened to the scientific data, they listened to our regulatory approach, and they agreed that this was possible.
After weeks of planning and waiting, the H1N1 vaccine has arrived.
All indicated reports are that it has the same safety profile as the seasonal flu vaccine.
Healthcare workers will be first to get the nasal spray version of the vaccine.
We were fortunate that this was an H1. If this had been an H5 or an H7 influenza, we would have been in a pickle.
You have this very significant challenge when you're trying to confront something that's new and there's not necessarily all the information that you might want to have known about that in advance, so you need to learn as you go.
The agency really needs to continue to think about how can we increase that speed.
When I started vaccine regulations at the FDA, of course, there was a lot to learn. The first vaccine that I had worked on was the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine Preparedness. I mean, after this vaccine was introduced a couple of years later, the cases went way down. And so that, was a part of my life when I thought I had really entered the right field. In May of 2012, I was appointed director of the Office of Vaccines Research and Review.
There's always a debate. Do you bring in somebody from the outside or do you hire from the inside? Well, I made sure that we got the inside covered. If we want this to be seamless and that learning curve to be short, Marion's the person.
I had spent a lot of years in the Office of Vaccines, and I assembled a team around me with skills and knowledge and experience that everybody could bring to the table.
Marion always would describe the work that was done in the office in the context of what we have done, not what I have done.
I knew that the team could handle anything that was coming.
A big outbreak of the deadly Ebola virus.
It's killed more than 2,100 people.
The number of cases could double every 3 weeks.
It was projected that there'd be more than 1 million cases of Ebola.
The Zaire strain really is known to kill anywhere between 40 and 90% of people who get the disease. So it is very scary.
You're gonna die. There's a good chance if you're infected, you're gonna die.
The world was on edge when this Ebola outbreak occurred, and it seemed to be completely out of control in West Africa.
Today, we are providing the information that an individual traveling from Liberia has been diagnosed with Ebola in the United States.
Ebola is not a disease native to the U.S. And that was the whole point of really pushing the global perspective early on. That disease, watch it.
American health officials are scrambling to contain the spread of Ebola here in the United States.
2 Americans being treated for the disease.
Texas health officials scramble to contain the deadly Ebola virus.
100 people who may have been exposed to Ebola.
Public concern is intensifying.
There was a scale and severity to that outbreak that we knew we really had to work fast.
The urgency of developing the vaccine was great.
The single most important thing that we can do to prevent a more serious Ebola outbreak in this country is making sure that we get what is a raging epidemic right now in West Africa under control.
You don't really think about regulations and rules at that time. You really think about how big is the public health emergency, and if you have a vaccine candidate, what are the data that you really need in order to make sure that you bring a safe and effective vaccine to the public?
Fortunately, at that time, there had been vaccine candidates that had been manufactured that were already available and sitting in a freezer.
So we started the Ebola outbreak with 2 vaccine candidates, but both of them needed to be developed very much from scratch.
I can, test the safety of a vaccine by giving it to healthy people, which is a normal way the vaccine safety is evaluated. But how are you going to test the efficacy of the vaccine? How are you going to test the ability of the vaccine to prevent the infection or prevent the disease?
If we really want to know if an Ebola vaccine works, we have to wait for an Ebola outbreak.
And here we had the opportunity to do so.
Experts are very worried by the spread of Ebola to Nigeria.
The disease has been confirmed to have crossed Guinea's national borders into Liberia.
In Liberia, the NIH was very eager to conduct a rigorous vaccine trial.
A placebo-controlled randomized trial where some people get the vaccine and some people get a placebo.
They set up clinics in Monrovia, the capital, to see whether or not there would be a difference in what happened to vaccinated versus placebo recipients.
Ebola cases in Liberia are now at 0.
The trouble is that the way the outbreak evolved, very quickly there were no cases in Monrovia.
If no one is getting Ebola, you can't tell for sure if the vaccine is protective.
So they were not able to study vaccine efficacy in that trial because of the way that it was set up in one place.
The only study that was able to declare efficacy of the vaccine was a study conducted and sponsored by the WHO in Guinea. That was the Ebola Sasufi ring vaccination study.
The ring vaccination trial that the WHO did was a very innovative design.
If you identify someone who has the disease, you identify all of their contacts, and that's referred to as a ring. So basically what you're trying to do by vaccination is contain that infection within that ring by vaccinating all of the people who are contacts of a person who has the disease, as well as, in many studies, the contacts of those contacts.
And then that gave you the advantage that the people you were studying the vaccine in were people who were at very high risk of getting infected. And so that increased the power of the trial. And the other thing that they did was they did a mobile study. They went to wherever the cases were. So rather than insisting on doing their study in one location, they were able to do their study all around Guinea.
There's no doubt in anybody's mind that the outbreak would have been much, much worse and much, much more extensive had it not been for the use of the vaccine.
So even though the outbreak was eventually controlled, the work had to continue in terms of bringing this vaccine toward licensure.
When the house is on fire, yeah, you got all the fire departments in the world putting it out. But then when it gets to an ember, people start leaving. And they start going away, not realizing that ember can catch on fire again. You have to be prepared. What are you going to do? You can't just leave this. And unfortunately, you see that. Well, we don't need to put the resources there anymore. Well, yeah, you do, because this is going to catch on fire again.
Ebola wasn't just restricted to the West African outbreak.
An outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo has infected more than 3,000 people.
There were other outbreaks within Africa that required major responses.
It took another couple of years to really have the data to support approval. So you need the preclinical data, you need clinical safety data, you need clinical immunogenicity data and efficacy data, but you also need manufacturing data. And you need to have faith or data. Faith is good, data is better, that the facility really can, is adequate to make the product.
This is where Marion provided a lot of leadership in maintaining these communications.
Working with the CDC, working with the other agencies to keep that going.
And making sure that as we were evaluating the data, we could provide the manufacturer with information that was going to be helpful to them even before the application actually came into us at FDA.
As director of the office, you have to wave the flag and say, well, we got to keep this going. And that's part of the mission, to work to make sure that we have these products available.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration formally approved the first vaccine to prevent Ebola.
It was in December of 2019. I signed the approval letter late in the day, and I think it was just a couple of days before the Christmas holidays. And we all said, okay, great, things would go easier going forward into 2020. And then COVID hit.
This morning, the Chinese city of Wuhan on lockdown.
The unprecedented measures being taken to contain the spread of that mysterious viral outbreak.
It could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens. Nobody really knows.
This is the test case because this is a new virus.
This was unlike anything that we'd ever faced before.
The latest on the coronavirus, which the World Health Organization officially declared a pandemic just moments ago.
The Ebola outbreak was localized. This had the potential really to circulate the whole globe.
There were 71 cases at the beginning of March. Now we're up over 1,000 cases and climbing.
It was alarming, the cases rising by the thousands and people falling ill and people dying. And knowing that we don't have vaccine candidates.
New York hospitals pushed to the brink. The state's coronavirus death toll had its largest single-day spike yet. 731 people died in just 24 hours. One about every 2 minutes.
This felt very different because your families, your community was directly affected.
There was a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of Marion and her colleagues, navigating the COVID-19 pandemic.
I don't think there was anybody who was working on this who wasn't a little bit afraid of COVID.
We will see more cases and things will get worse than they are right now.
Usually when we have an applicant who wants to develop a vaccine, they submit meeting requests, we schedule a meeting, they submit briefing booklets, we have some time to review that. None of this.
We have this problem. You know it as the industry, I know it. How do we work together to get solutions? Marion knew how to do that.
We took people that were busy with work on other biological products, and we said, we need your help, you need to help us. And this is how we deprioritize the work on other, preventive vaccines.
Some of what we're seeing right now in medicine and in developing these vaccine trials have never been done before. So we're seeing, a chapter in medical history being written right now.
One of the companies came in March. I remember that it was one of the last face-to-face meetings we had because shortly thereafter, everybody was sent home and nobody came to the office anymore. And we discussed the situation and what the company would be able to do using that mRNA technology in terms of developing a vaccine.
We, the FDA, are going to have to help you. We're going to have to collaborate on get moving this forward.
There was no waiting for a meeting to be scheduled. There was not another 2 months for us to review a briefing document. So it was decided in that meeting. And then the company submitted the data, and we started reviewing the data. And when it was Friday that they submitted it, these data were reviewed on Saturdays and Sundays so that on Monday we could provide the sponsor with a response.
We were able to say COVID is the #1 priority, and other work then could be set aside.
An all-hands-on-deck approach. And there was the sense of urgency, and people understood the gravity of that public health situation.
The Trump administration is organizing a Manhattan Project-style effort called Operation Warp Speed to drastically cut the time needed to develop a coronavirus vaccine.
What Operation Warp Speed did was it de-risked everything for the developers.
Operation Warp Speed has changed the game of drug development by harnessing the entire power of the government to drive faster development by allowing us to de-risk the financial risk of drug companies.
You're gonna work on the manufacturing process and scaling up the material and making lots of doses, while in parallel, clinical trials to demonstrate the safety and the efficacy of these products are ongoing.
A pharmaceutical company would never make commercial-scale, multi-million production lots of vaccine while they're still testing the vaccine in early stages. We did just that.
So everything that a manufacturer could have imagined as a risk in vaccine development was taken away.
That was a really critical point.
So this, of course, accelerated in the end also the availability of these vaccines.
Really, and German company BioNTech and their American partner Pfizer have now started clinical trials for a possible coronavirus vaccine in the United States.
A simple injection that some hope could help bring an end to a global pandemic.
It was election year, and there was, of course, interest to get these vaccines out to the public as soon as possible.
We're rounding the curve. We're coming up with vaccines. I think the vaccines are going to be announced very soon.
And of course, all of us, including the vaccine manufacturers, were working very hard to enable that.
We're on track to deliver and distribute the vaccine in a very, very safe and effective manner. We think we can start sometime in October.
It came to a standoff in October of 2020 because we had actually developed at that time a draft guidance document for industry in which we were laying out the criteria that clinical trial subjects needed to be followed up for a median time of 2 months. Safety follow-up.
This was already the shortest follow-up that anybody could imagine that one would want to have for this kind of a vaccine enterprise. And in fact, the WHO recommended longer follow-up.
The FDA is reportedly considering stricter guidelines for the emergency authorization of a COVID vaccine. Are you okay with that?
Well, I tell you what, we're looking at that. That has to be approved by the White House. We may or may not approve it. That sounds like a political move.
If this guidance were followed, this would interfere with the stated goal of the president to make vaccines available before the election.
And so there were voices that the White House would not clear that guidance document.
You've seen the president say he believed people at the FDA were deliberately delaying progress to hurt him politically.
That's something that Marion had to do as a director that I never had to do. I had never been in that situation where the executive branch was not in step with us.
We're going to take a look at it, and ultimately the White House has to approve it. And maybe we will and maybe we won't.
I thought, then I have to do it differently. And I talked to Phil Krause about it. And what we decided to do is describe the principles of what was contained in the emergency use authorization guidance document for our advisory committee.
Vaccine development can be expedited. However, I want to stress that it cannot and must not be rushed, as it takes time to accrue the adequate manufacturing, safety, and effectiveness data for these vaccines to support their use in millions of healthy people.
In the end, actually, Maury and I wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine which explained why it is that we needed that level of rigor in evaluating these vaccines.
So we made sure that our principles and the justification thereof were published and were publicly discussed. And the WRPA members, these are experts from around the country, they agreed with us. And so a couple of weeks later, the guidance was cleared.
The Trump administration has signed off on the FDA's standards for an emergency vaccine.
We were able to hold the line and make sure that the overall quality of vaccine evaluation was at the level that we thought it needed to be.
You have to be somewhat stoic and stubborn, and you just have to stick to your guns.
A hopeful moment in the battle against the coronavirus. The FDA Advisory Committee officially recommending emergency use authorization of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine.
The New York Times breaking the news that the FDA has just approved the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine tonight.
On the day when we finally found out that the vaccines did work, it had high effectiveness, that was the best feeling in the world. And in fact, that feeling continues because these vaccines have continued to protect people, continue to protect them against severe disease, and have turned the pandemic from something that everybody was afraid of into something that the world can finally live with.
If you think about unsung heroes, I mean, I think the people who worked at the FDA during the COVID pandemic, I mean, at least in the vaccine areas, really worked incredibly hard with tremendous dedication to try to really do the right thing for the American public. And because the FDA is one of the preeminent regulatory authorities in the world, you know, their decisions have global implications.
I had been regulating vaccines for quite a number of years, and so was Phil Krause, and so were many of my team members, and people knew us, the public health community knew us, and I think there was certain trust in us that we could get the work done. So I think we had that support, and that made a big difference.
Many of the people who worked on COVID vaccines would say that we were pretty lucky in our response to COVID.
It's kind of amazing that so many things happened all at once, and that progress was made as quickly as it was. But that being said, that's not a model for the future.
Happening now, Uganda trying to contain an outbreak of a rare strain of Ebola.
At least 29 people, including several health workers, have died from the relatively rare Sudan strain of the
Now Ebola is upon us again, and it is different this time because it is a different species of the Ebola virus. It is Ebola Sudan, and in 2014 through 16, and then also the repeated outbreaks in 18, 19, 20, that was Ebola Zaire.
We don't have a vaccine that's been demonstrated to be efficacious for Ebola Sudan.
What is perhaps the good news is that it appears to be localized, and it appears to be that cases are waning. But unfortunately, it illustrates and shows us that, again, we're not sufficiently prepared.
Marion, she's taken on a senior role at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI.
Many of the disease areas where IAVI works, there's new approaches that are necessary.
They're trying to facilitate new vaccines for emerging and neglected diseases.
It's very, very important to have people with Marion's skills doing those kinds of things to make sure that we can be better prepared for the next pandemic. And what that means is that in order to be even faster in the next pandemic, we have to lay more groundwork.
You cannot only talk about development of vaccines or other treatments or countermeasures, you also have to engage in surveillance activities.
You have to be prepared to detect the pandemic when it's occurring, and hopefully you can detect it before it becomes a pandemic.
You cannot only involve regulators, you cannot only involve vaccine manufacturers or public health agencies. You really need to involve societies or the communities that are affected in these outbreak areas.
You gotta think about those people who you can't see, because the pandemic is not over until everybody on the planet is protected.
Collaboration is really at the heart of the matter.
This kind of new thinking about how you can prepare in advance to be able to move quickly when an emerging threat arises is really of fundamental importance as we think about preparing for future threats.
We do an excellent job of being proactive when it comes to the military. We have planes we've never flown. We have jets we'll never fly, but they're ready. Where's the factory to build some syringes? Where's the resources for the R&D on a serious level to build these vaccines? Where are the resources to do global surveillance of infectious diseases? You have to beg with your hand out.
Ensuring that there is a commitment to invest in these resources is, I think, key to public preparedness.
We act now to prepare for the next, emerging infectious disease threat.
So that when that pandemic does occur, we're starting somewhere on the runway rather than at the gate.
If the public health community and other stakeholders and industry come together to address a public health problem, then it is possible to develop safe and effective countermeasures and make them available to people to be able to protect them from these serious diseases.